Dr. Edmund Hartley was replacing a rotted fence post on his small Iowa farm when he saw Raymond Whitmore's pickup truck turn off the county road and onto his gravel driveway. The November afternoon was cold enough that Edmund's breath misted in the air, and his 78-year-old hands ached from gripping the post-hole digger. But he stopped working immediately, because Raymond's unannounced visits always meant something important. They'd been friends long enough that Edmund could read trouble in the way his old friend drove, the particular speed and determination that said this wasn't a social call. Raymond climbed out of the truck slowly, his movements carrying the stiffness of a man who'd spent 7 decades doing ranch work. They were the same age, had been friends since they were 7 years old walking to school together, but life had weathered them differently. Edmund had spent his career as a veterinarian, while Raymond had built Whitmore Cattle Company into one of the most prestigious Angus operations in the Midwest, 8,000 acres of prime Iowa farmland producing genetics that sold across the country. "Ray," Edmund called, setting down his tools and walking toward the driveway, noting the tension in his old friend's shoulders. "What's wrong?" Raymond didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the back of his truck and lowered the tailgate, revealing a small black Angus bull calf standing in the bed. The calf couldn't have been more than 8 months old, and even Edmund's untrained eye could see he was undersized, maybe 500 pounds when he should have been pushing 700. But what struck Edmund most wasn't the calf's size. It was his eyes, dark, intelligent, and watchful in a way that suggested far more awareness than most cattle displayed. The calf stood perfectly still, not with the nervous energy of a frightened animal, but with the calm assessment of someone taking measure of a new situation. "This is what's wrong," Raymond said quietly, and Edmund heard decades of frustration and disappointment compressed into those 4 words. Edmund studied the calf more carefully, his veterinary training automatically cataloging details. Small? Yes, significantly undersized for his age. But his bone structure was excellent, his coat glossy despite his size, his stance balanced and correct. This wasn't a sickly runt. This was a small calf who happened to be perfectly healthy. "Tell me," Edmund said, leaning against the truck bed. Raymond sighed, the sound carrying 7 decades of friendship that meant they didn't need to dance around difficult conversations. "You remember Harrison Blackwell?" Edmund nodded. Harrison Blackwell was a name everyone in Iowa cattle circles knew. A tech billionaire who'd made his fortune in Silicon Valley, then returned to his Iowa roots 10 years ago with unlimited money and the ambition to build the ultimate cattle operation. Blackwell Ranch spanned 15,000 acres, employed 80 people, and operated with the kind of corporate efficiency that treated cattle breeding like a software optimization problem. "Blackwell commissioned 20 custom embryos from me last year," Raymond continued. "Top genetics money could buy. Each embryo cost him $50,000, $1 million total investment. He wanted bulls that would be massive, dominant, aggressive, everything the industry worships." Raymond's voice carried bitter irony. 19 of the 20 turned out exactly as ordered. Big, aggressive, dominant, worth $200,000 each at maturity. "And the 20th?" Edmund asked, though he was already looking at the answer standing in Raymond's truck. "This one." Raymond reached out and gently touched the calf's shoulder. "Born 3 months ago from the same genetics as his brothers, same embryo technology, same everything. But he's small, significantly smaller than his siblings." Blackwell took one look at him and rejected him outright. Said he was defective, that small bulls had no place in a premium breeding program, that I'd obviously made some mistake in the embryo process. "Did you?" Edmund asked. "I had him tested by 3 different veterinary genetics labs," Raymond said. "His DNA matches the embryo specifications perfectly. He's got the same elite bloodlines as his 19 brothers. There's no genetic defect, no health issues, no explanation for why he's small, he just is." Edmund looked at the calf again, seeing something in the way the animal held himself that nagged at his trained instincts. "What does Blackwell want you to do with him?" "Cull him," Raymond said flatly. "He won't take him back, won't pay for him, considers him worthless. He said, and I quote, 'I don't invest in runts, Whitmore. I build champions.'" Edmund felt anger spark in his chest. He'd known Raymond since they were 7 years old, since they'd walked to Prairie View Elementary School together, carrying lunch pails their mothers packed. They'd played baseball in the summer heat until dark, had been co-captains of the high school football team, had been best men at each other's weddings 71 years ago. Raymond's integrity was absolute. If he said the genetics were correct, they were correct. "So you brought him to me," Edmund said. "I brought him to you because I can't cull him, Ed." Raymond's voice cracked slightly. "Not when I look at him and see nothing wrong except size. Not when every test says his genetics are exceptional. Not when my gut tells me that being small doesn't mean being defective." He paused, then added quietly, "And because you were always the smallest guy on our football team, and you were also the best offensive lineman this county ever produced. You taught me that size isn't the same as ability." Edmund remembered those years with sudden clarity. He'd been 5'9" and 165 pounds playing against boys who outweighed him by 50 pounds. Coaches had told him he was too small for the position. His own father had suggested he try track instead. But Raymond, already the team's star quarterback, had insisted Edmund deserved a starting position, had defended him when others doubted, had thrown pass after pass behind the protection Edmund provided until scouts from the university came to watch them play. "What do you want me to do with him?" Edmund asked, though he already knew the answer. "Take him, raise him, see what he becomes." Raymond looked directly at Edmund now, and his eyes carried the same stubborn determination that had characterized 7 decades of friendship. "Ed, I can't sell him. Blackwell's rejection has already spread through the industry. Everyone knows about the defective Whitmore calf. Nobody will touch him, but you don't care what the industry thinks. You never have." Edmund studied the calf, who was now watching him with those remarkably intelligent eyes, and felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt since Margaret died 3 years ago. Purpose, curiosity, the veterinary instinct that had guided 5 decades of practice. The instinct that said sometimes what everyone calls defective is actually just different. "How much?" Edmund asked. Raymond shook his head. "Ed, I'm not asking you to buy him. I'm asking you to save him from being culled. Take him for free. That's not how our friendship works, Ray, and you know it." Edmund's voice was firm. "You invested in these genetics. This calf has value, even if Blackwell's too arrogant to see it. What would you normally charge for a calf from this breeding? If he was full-sized? 15 to 20,000 at this age. Then I'll give you 8,000. Half of minimum value, recognizing the size issue but respecting the genetics." "Ed, you don't have to—" "I want to," Edmund interrupted. "Because I spent 53 years as a veterinarian learning that appearances deceive, that small doesn't mean weak, and that the animals everyone else rejects often turn out to be the most valuable. And because you defended me when I was the small guy everyone doubted. This feels like returning a favor that's 70 years overdue." Raymond's throat worked visibly, and Edmund saw the glisten of tears in his old friend's eyes. They'd known each other long enough that emotion wasn't embarrassing between them. They'd cried together at weddings and funerals, at victories and losses, through 7 decades of the joys and sorrows that made a life. "What will you name him?" Raymond asked quietly. Edmund looked at the small bull calf who'd been rejected for not meeting a billionaire's expectations and felt a kinship that transcended species. Both of them judged inadequate because of size. Both of them dismissed by people who couldn't see past surface measurements to recognize actual value. "David," Edmund said, "because sometimes the smallest one turns out to be the giant killer." Raymond helped Edmund unload David from the truck bed, and the small bull walked down the ramp with careful, deliberate steps. Not timid, but cautious in the way of an intelligent animal assessing unfamiliar territory. Edmund led him to the smaller pasture behind his barn, the one he'd been saving for the cow he kept planning to buy but never did, because buying cattle felt too much like admitting he'd move on from Margaret's death and build a life without her. Now David stood in that pasture, looking remarkably small against the 5 acres of brown November grass, and Edmund felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever loneliness ambushed him at unexpected moments. "He'll need extra feed this winter," Raymond said, standing beside Edmund at the fence. "Smaller animals lose heat faster. He's healthy now, but if he drops weight in cold weather, it could compromise his development. I'll take care of him," Edmund promised, and the commitment felt like more than just animal husbandry. It felt like purpose. Raymond left as afternoon shadows lengthened across the Iowa farmland, and Edmund stood alone watching David explore his new home. The calf moved with surprising grace despite his small stature, investigating every corner of the pasture with methodical thoroughness that suggested intelligence beyond what Edmund typically observed in cattle. That night, Edmund sat at his kitchen table with a notebook, the same kind he'd used for 53 years documenting veterinary cases, and started a new record. David, Nov, 15, age, 8 months, weight, approximately 500 lbs, expected weight for age genetics, 700 plus lbs, deficit, 200 plus lbs. He paused, pen hovering over paper, then added, note, size deficit does not correlate with apparent health, temperament, or intelligence. Vigor appears exceptional despite small frame. Hypothesis, size may not predict quality. Over the following weeks, Edmund fell into a routine that surprised him with how much it resembled the purpose he'd felt during his veterinary career. He fed David twice daily, meticulously measuring portions to ensure optimal nutrition without overfeeding. He spent an hour each evening in the pasture, simply observing, the same way he'd observed countless animals as a vet, training himself to notice the subtle signs that indicated health or illness, contentment or distress. What he noticed about David was remarkable. The calf was small, yes. By December, he should have weighed 800 pounds but barely topped 550. But his small size came with unexpected advantages. He moved with an efficiency that his larger siblings probably lacked. He ate less but seemed to extract more nutrition from each pound of feed, maintaining excellent body condition on a diet that should have left him thin. His metabolism was different, optimized in ways Edmund's veterinary training hadn't prepared him to recognize. More significantly, David's intelligence was extraordinary. Within 2 weeks, he'd learned to respond to Edmund's voice, to come when called, to stand calmly for basic health checks. He displayed curiosity rather than fear, approaching new objects and situations with careful assessment rather than panic. Edmund had worked with thousands of cattle during his career, and David's cognitive awareness exceeded anything he'd previously encountered. On a cold January afternoon, Edmund's daughter Jennifer visited from Des Moines, bringing groceries and the gentle concern she'd shown since Margaret's death. She found her father in David's pasture, standing in ankle-deep snow, talking quietly to the small bull who stood close enough to touch. "Dad!" Jennifer called from the fence, her voice carrying worry. "You're going to freeze out here." Edmund turned, realizing he'd been outside for over an hour without noticing the cold. "Jen, come meet David." She climbed through the fence reluctantly, a city woman uncomfortable around livestock, but stopped short when David approached her with calm curiosity rather than the skittish energy she associated with cattle. "He's small," she observed. "He's perfect," Edmund corrected, and heard the defensive edge in his own voice. "Everyone judges him for being small. Nobody looks past size to see what's actually there." Jennifer studied her father's face, still handsome at 78, still sharp despite the grief that had hollowed him after losing her mother. "Dad, are we still talking about the bull?" Edmund felt something crack in his chest. His daughter had always been perceptive. Maybe not entirely. "You're not too old to matter," Jennifer said quietly. "Mom's death doesn't make you obsolete. Your years of experience don't become worthless just because you're retired." "The world treats you that way," Edmund said. "Too old for veterinary work. Too old for new relationships. Too old to have opinions that matter. Just too old." "Is that what this is about?" Jennifer gestured at David. "Proving you're still relevant?" "Maybe," Edmund admitted. "Or maybe proving that the things everyone dismisses, small bulls, old men, anything that doesn't fit the industry's idea of valuable, maybe those things have worth that can't be measured by conventional standards." Jennifer was quiet for a moment, watching David nose at Edmund's coat pocket where he kept grain treats. "What does Uncle Ray think?" "Ray believes in him," Edmund said. "That billionaire, Blackwell, he spent $1 million on genetics and rejected David because he's small. But Ray's spent 70 years breeding cattle, and his instincts tell him David's special. Sometimes experience sees what money misses. By February, David had gained only 50 pounds despite optimal nutrition. Growing, but at a pace that confirmed he'd never match his siblings' size. Edmund documented everything, feed conversion rates, health markers, behavioral observations. The data painted a picture that challenged everything conventional wisdom said about cattle value. David was small, but he was thriving in ways that had nothing to do with size. One evening, as Edmund sat reviewing his notes, the phone rang. Raymond's voice came through with barely contained excitement. "Ed, I need you to bring David to my ranch tomorrow. There's someone I want to show him to, someone who might actually understand what we're seeing." The next morning, Edmund loaded David into his small livestock trailer, a process that took less than 5 minutes because the bull calf loaded calmly, without the resistance or fear most cattle displayed. As Edmund drove the 30 miles to Raymond's ranch, he found himself talking to David through the trailer's sliding window. "Ray says there's someone important coming to see you. Don't know who, but he sounded excited." Edmund felt foolish talking to a bull, but the loneliness of the past 3 years had taught him that conversation mattered, even when the listener couldn't answer back. Raymond's ranch sprawled across the Iowa landscape like a monument to generational success. White fences perfectly maintained, barns that could house 100 head, equipment newer than most people's cars. But Raymond himself stood at the main gate in worn work boots and a faded jacket, looking exactly like the boy Edmund had walked to school with 70 years ago. "She's already here," Raymond said as Edmund climbed out of the truck. "Dr. Patricia Moreno from Iowa State. She's a geneticist, Ed, specialized in something called efficiency phenotypes. I sent her my data on David 3 weeks ago. She drove 4 hours to see him." They found Dr. Moreno in Raymond's office, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and an intensity that reminded Edmund of his own younger self when he'd been consumed by veterinary puzzles. She stood when they entered, shaking Edmund's hand with a grip that suggested someone used to handling large animals. "Dr. Hartley, your notes on this calf are remarkable, detailed, systematic, objective. You documented patterns I'd need 3 graduate students and 6 months to compile." "I've 53 years as a veterinarian," Edmund said. "Observation becomes habit." "Your observations," Dr. Moreno said, pulling out a tablet filled with charts and graphs, "suggest something I've been researching for 8 years. Mr. Whitmore's breeding program accidentally created what we call an efficiency phenotype, an animal whose body is optimized for resource conversion rather than size maximization." She pulled up a comparison chart. "David's 19 brothers consume 30% more feed, require 40% more space, generate 35% more waste. But their actual reproductive output, the offspring they'll produce, won't be significantly superior to David's, assuming his fertility matches his siblings. He's smaller, but he's more efficient in almost every measurable way." Edmund felt something ignite in his chest, the same feeling he'd gotten when a diagnosis finally made sense after weeks of puzzling symptoms. "So he's not defective. He's just different." "He's potentially revolutionary," Dr. Moreno corrected. "The cattle industry selects for size because bigger animals bring higher sale prices, but size requires more resources, more feed, more land, more water. In an era of climate change and resource scarcity, efficiency matters more than size. David represents genetics the industry has been inadvertently breeding away for decades." Raymond leaned forward. "Are you saying David's actually more valuable than his brothers?" "I'm saying he might be invaluable," Dr. Moreno replied. "If his fertility and offspring quality match his efficiency metrics, he could be the foundation for an entirely new breeding approach, one that prioritizes sustainability and resource efficiency over raw size." Edmund thought about Blackwell, the billionaire who'd rejected David as worthless, and felt vindication warm as summer sun. "When can you test him?" "I'd like to start immediately. Comprehensive genetic mapping, hormone panels, fertility evaluation. With your permission, Dr. Hartley, I'd like to make David the subject of a formal research study through Iowa State." Edmund looked at the small bull standing calmly in Raymond's holding pen, the calf everyone had dismissed, and felt 7 decades of friendship culminating in this moment. Ray had trusted him to see value where others saw failure. Now science was validating what instinct had known. "On one condition," Edmund said. "Whatever you discover, David stays with me. He's not going to some university research facility. He's not becoming property of people who see him as data rather than a living being." Dr. Moreno smiled. "Dr. Hartley, that's exactly the condition I was hoping you'd make. The best research happens when animals are treated as partners, not specimens. 6 months later, Edmund sat in his kitchen reading Dr. Moreno's published research paper for the third time, still hardly believing what the data showed. David, now 14 months old and still significantly smaller than standard bulls his age, had become the center of a study that was quietly circulating through university agricultural departments across the country. The findings were extraordinary. David's feed conversion efficiency was 43% better than his larger siblings. His carbon footprint, the resources required to maintain him, was 38% lower. Most significantly, his fertility tests showed sperm count and motility in the top 2% of all tested Angus bulls, regardless of size. His small stature hadn't compromised his reproductive capability at all. If anything, his efficient metabolism seemed to enhance it. Revolutionary genetics hiding in a package the industry had trained itself not to see, the paper concluded. This case study suggests that decades of selection for size may have inadvertently bred away efficiency traits that will become critical as agriculture faces resource constraints. The phone rang, interrupting Edmund's reading. Raymond's voice came through with barely contained excitement. "Ed, turn on your computer, check your email. There's something you need to see." Edmund fumbled with his laptop, technology Margaret had insisted he learn before she died, and opened the email Raymond had forwarded. It was from Harrison Blackwell, the billionaire who'd rejected David 9 months ago. "Mr. Whitmore, I've read Dr. Moreno's paper on the efficiency phenotype bull. I understand this is the calf I rejected from your program. I'm prepared to offer $250,000 to purchase him for my breeding program. This offer stands for 48 hours. Edmund felt his hand tighten on the phone. "Ray, tell me you're not considering this." "Of course not," Raymond said firmly. "But Ed, do you understand what this means? Blackwell rejected David as worthless 9 months ago. Now he's offering $250,000 because science validated what we saw with our eyes. The industry's entire value system just got challenged." Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more offers came. $300,000, $400,000, finally $500,000 from a breeding consortium in Texas. Each offer, Edmund declined without hesitation. David wasn't for sale at any price, but the attention triggered something Edmund hadn't anticipated. Other breeders began reviewing their own herds, looking for smaller animals they'd previously dismissed. Dr. Moreno received inquiries from 17 different operations asking her to evaluate bulls and cows that didn't fit conventional size standards. One evening, Jennifer visited and found her father in David's pasture as usual. The bull, now approaching full size at a compact 2,400 pounds, small by industry standards but perfectly proportioned, stood calmly while Edmund checked his hooves. "Dad, you're famous," Jennifer said, climbing through the fence. "The Des Moines Register wants to interview you about the bull that changed everything." "I'm not famous," Edmund corrected. "David is. I just refuse to judge him by the wrong standards." "You did more than that," Jennifer insisted. "You trusted your own observations over an entire industry's assumptions. At 78, when most people are playing it safe, you challenged conventional wisdom." Edmund thought about that, about how buying David had given him purpose when he'd felt obsolete, had validated instincts he'd spent 5 decades developing, had proven that experience and careful observation could see truths that money and technology missed. "Your mother used to say something," Edmund told his daughter. She'd say, "Edmund, the world judges by appearances, but you judge by truth. Don't ever lose that." His voice caught. I'd forgotten that lesson after she died. David reminded me. Raymond visited the following weekend, and the 2 old friends stood at the fence watching David graze peacefully. "Blackwell's offering $750,000 now," Raymond said. "That's nearly as much as all 19 of David's brothers combined." "Still not for sale," Edmund replied. "I know, but Ed, you realize what you've done? You've forced the industry to question a century of assumptions. Breeding programs across the country are reevaluating their selection criteria, all because you saw value in a small bull everyone else dismissed." Edmund shook his head. "All I did was trust my friend's judgment and my own eyes. The rest was David proving what he always was, exceptional, regardless of size." As the sun set over the Iowa farmland, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, Edmund felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret died. Contentment, purpose, the knowledge that his final years had meaning. David had been rejected by a billionaire for being too small. But he'd taught an industry that value couldn't be measured in pounds, that efficiency mattered more than size, and that sometimes the most important discoveries came from refusing to accept conventional wisdom. And he'd taught a 78-year-old man that being overlooked didn't mean being worthless. It just meant the world was measuring with the wrong ruler. 18 months after Edmund bought David for $8,000, the small bull had become a legend. Not because he'd grown to match his sibling's size, he hadn't, topping out at a compact 1,500 pounds, but because his first offspring had been born, and the data was irrefutable. Edmund stood in his pasture on a warm June morning, watching David's 3 calves play near their mothers. All 3 were slightly smaller than conventional calves their age, but all 3 were healthier, more vigorous, and growing on 35% less feed than comparable calves on neighboring farms. The mothers had recovered from birth faster, produced more milk, and showed none of the stress that often accompanied raising calves sired by larger, more aggressive bulls. Dr. Moreno had documented everything, and her follow-up paper was now required reading in agricultural programs at 15 universities. The David Protocol, breeders were calling it, selection criteria that prioritized efficiency, fertility, and temperament over raw size. Raymond visited that morning, bringing news that made Edmund's chest tighten with emotion. The American Angus Association just announced a new classification system. They're adding efficiency ratings to their genetic evaluations. Ed, your bull changed industry standards. Our bull, Edmund corrected. You believed in him first. They stood together in comfortable silence, 2 78-year-old men who'd been friends for 71 years, watching a small bull who'd been rejected as worthless prove that value came in unexpected packages. Edmund's phone buzzed with yet another purchase offer, this one for $1.2 million. He deleted it without reading past the number. David had never been for sale and never would be. This wasn't about money. It was about proving that the world's measurements were often wrong, that being dismissed didn't mean being worthless, that sometimes the smallest voice carried the most important message. Jennifer arrived that afternoon with her 2 teenage sons, who'd rarely visited the farm before. Now they stood at the fence, fascinated by the bull who'd become famous for being small. "Grandpa," the older boy asked, "why didn't you sell him when people offered so much money?" Edmund thought about loneliness after Margaret died, about feeling obsolete and overlooked, about how David had given him purpose when he'd felt purposeless. Because some things matter more than money. David needed someone who'd see his value when everyone else called him worthless. I needed something to believe in when I felt worthless myself. We saved each other. As sunset painted the Iowa sky in shades of rose and gold, Edmund sat on his porch watching David graze peacefully. The bull who'd been rejected by a billionaire for being too small had revolutionized breeding standards, challenged a century of assumptions, and validated the instincts of an old man everyone thought was past his prime. But more than that, David had proven what Edmund had always believed but sometimes forgot. That worth wasn't measured by size or age or conventional standards. That being different wasn't the same as being defective. That the most valuable things in life were often the ones everyone else overlooked. Harrison Blackwell had spent $1 million creating 19 bulls that fit industry expectations perfectly. But the 20th bull, the small one, the rejected one, the one given away for $8,000, had changed everything. Edmund raised his coffee cup toward David in silent salute. "To the runts," he whispered. "May we always prove them wrong." The small bull lifted his head as if he'd heard, and in his dark, intelligent eyes, Edmund saw understanding. They'd both been underestimated. They'd both been dismissed. And together, they'd both proven that the world's measurements were often catastrophically wrong. That was legacy enough for any man or any bull. The rest was just numbers that people like Blackwell would never understand. Billionaire rejected bull for being too small, but what 78-year-old man saw changed all.